Hello, my name is Jonathan Milne. My purpose today is to brief you on my examination of a moment in Australia's history, which I believe represented Australia's greatest threat of hostile military invasion by a foreign power. I'll be talking about Japan's attacks on Australia in 1942, and in particular the fragility of the situation and how slightly different outcomes could have led to a very different and dire situation for Australia. After Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 1941, debate among Japan's Navy admirals and the Army's generals intensified on how to spread military action throughout Southeast Asia. Eventually, a plan was approved called FS Operation. The plan was to sever Australia's lifeline to the United States and Britain by striking a series of strategical blows that would shock Australia into submission. On February 19, 1942, a force of 242 aircraft attacked Darwin. It was obvious Australia was ill-equipped and ill-prepared for an attack, even though it was expected at some point. Japan successfully managed to get submarines as far south as Sydney and Newcastle. From these main submarines, midget subs were deployed, conducting missile night raids on Sydney Harbour on the 31st of May 1942, killing 21 sailors aboard HMAS Cuttable. And again, they attacked in Newcastle on the 8th of June 1942, releasing 34 shells into various targets. So I wonder, what would have been the consequence for Australia had the Japanese war chiefs been able to agree on a more aggressive invasion of the Australian mainland? If Japan had placed aircraft carriers further down the Australian eastern coast to target Sydney more directly, air, sea and potential troop deployments on the ground could have crippled our major infrastructure and brought the city to its knees. And if so, our flag may look very different today, as would our national identity. I believe the most important factor in determining the actual outcome for Australia was the fact that, thankfully, the Japanese did not decide on a more thorough and widespread land invasion at the time. Although they targeted Darwin, obviously, in particular because of its strategical importance to Australia and the Allies in the region at the time. My second factor for the actual outcome came down to the internal disagreement within the Japanese military ranks and how their indecisiveness potentially spared Australia from a much darker fate. My third factor in the actual outcome, I believe, came down to the defeat of Japan in the Coral Sea. Being their first major naval defeat in the Pacific, I believe it was a major turning point and halted the aggression of Japan in the region, as well as forcing them to alter their priorities, all of which served to take focus away from any possible Australian invasion. Alternatively, I believe the most important factor in driving an alternate outcome for Australia during the Japanese attacks in World War II was the absolute contempt in which the Japanese held Australia at that time. Australia, it seemed, was basically viewed by Japan as a minor obstacle that needed to be moulded into submission. In the early months of 1942, the Japanese Prime Minister General Hideki Tojo called on Australia to surrender to Japan, promising to be merciful in that case. Prime Minister Tojo was planning on incorporating Australia into a puppet state, into a compliant political bloc called the New Order. Also, Australia would become part of an economic bloc called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. These plans to me demonstrate a well thought out list of intentions for Australia and the region as a whole, intentions to obviously take full control of the region. These views are supported by readings I found in Senshi Sosho, the official history of Japan's involvement in World War II. My second factor supporting alternative outcome for Australia is the nice edge we existed on throughout 1941 and 1942. The Asia Pacific was being torn apart by a Japanese juggernaut. The Allies' priority of beat Hitler first saw a focus of resources in Europe rather than further adding to Australia's fragility in the region. Key battles such as Kokoda and the Battle of Milne Bay were integral in resisting the Japanese warhorse. And if they won, they threatened to snowball to an even greater Japanese force that limited US troops could arguably not oppose. I support this view from an article I found by David Horner called Defending Australia in 1942. My final factor in a possible alternative outcome finishes with the Japanese armies and generals. The admirals were the aggressors, obviously requiring the army's assistance to land ground troops. The agreement never came. I believe that if they had reached an agreement at that time to land ground troops with the initial attacks on Darwin, Australia's northwest may have been overwhelmed. And if Japan were able to establish themselves on the Australian mainland at that point, again the pendulum may have swung too far. Japan's way to be pulled back. History may have taken a very different path. In conclusion, I believe that the outcome for Australia in the lead up to, during and after the attacks was mainly due to chance. The region was in turmoil. Japan in 1941 and 1942 was progressing at an astonishing rate, and Australia was in their sights. The actual outcome for us hung in the balance. Thankfully, the balance tilted our way. However, for one country to be such a sound, effective military machine against multiple others, including some major powers, I believe we were lucky to avoid quite an incomprehensible fate. Thank you.